At the start of the 20th century, Panama was not yet an independent nation.
It was a province of Colombia, strategically important but politically marginalized.
Its narrow strip of land, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, had long been seen as a gateway that could change global trade forever.
For centuries, empires dreamed of building a canal across the isthmus, but no one had succeeded.
By the 1900s, the United States believed it was time to make that dream real. And to die that, Panama would need to break away from Colombia.
The idea of a canal had grown especially urgent after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The U.S. Navy had struggled to move ships quickly between oceans, revealing the need for a faster maritime route. A canal through Central America would transform American military power, global trade, and geopolitical influence. But first, the United States needed permission from Colombia, which controlled the territory. Negotiations began. The U.S. offered to lease a strip of land in Panama for the construction of the canal. They promised payment, infrastructure, and long-term partnership. But the Colombian government, cautious and divided, rejected the proposal. Many Colombians feared they were giving away too much sovereignty or losing control over territory that could become extremely valuable. When Colombia refused the treaty in 1903, it put the entire canal project in jeopardy. American leaders saw the rejection as a direct obstacle to their interests. President Theodore Roosevelt, determined to build the canal, believed that Colombia had sabotaged progress. At the same time, Panamanians themselves were increasingly frustrated with the government in Bogotá. Many felt ignored, neglected, and economically disadvantaged. Local elites, merchants, and workers all understood that a canal could transform Panama into a prosperous crossroads of the world. But as long as they remained part of Colombia, that future seemed impossible. This tension created an opportunity. Panamanian independence supporters, including businessmen and political leaders, began communicating with American officials. They shared a common goal: separation from Colombia. The United States, eager to complete the canal, offered silent support for an independence movement. Although the U.S. did not openly declare its intentions, its actions made clear that it was prepared to protect a newly independent Panama. In November 1903, a carefully coordinated plan unfolded. Panamanian rebels declared their independence from Colombia, raising a new flag and forming a provisional government. Local leaders rallied support throughout the isthmus. Crowds gathered in the streets, hopeful that this moment would change their future. But the decisive factor came from the sea. American warships positioned themselves along the coast to prevent Colombian forces from landing and suppressing the rebellion. The presence of the U.S. Navy sent a powerful message. Without firing a single shot, American forces ensured that Colombia could not retake the province. The rebellion succeeded not because Panama had a strong army, but because the United States had chosen to support the separation. Within days, the new Republic of Panama was recognized by the United States, giving the young nation immediate international legitimacy. For Panama, independence was both a triumph and a negotiation. The new government celebrated freedom from Colombia and the opportunity to control its destiny. Yet independence came with conditions. Almost immediately, the U.S. requested the signing of the Habuna-Varilla Treaty, granting the United States control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone across Panama. Though the treaty enabled the construction of the canal, it also gave the United States sovereign-like authority over this territorial decision that created tensions for generations. Panamanians had mixed feelings. Some believed independence and the canal would bring progress, jobs, and global significance. Others felt that Panama had traded one foreign influence for another. They questioned whether the new republic had surrendered too much land and authority to the United States in exchange for political support. But in 1903, the prevailing emotion was hope. The prospect of economic development overshadowed concerns about sovereignty, at least for the moment. For the United States, supporting Panama's separation was strategic. Gaining control of the Canal Zone meant securing a maritime route that would reshape global power. Politically, it demonstrated America's growing influence in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt famously declared, "I took the isthmus," implying that decisive action had been necessary to accomplish a great goal. Critics, however, argued that the U.S. had interfered in Colombia's internal affairs for its own benefit. Over the following months, Panama began functioning as an independent nation. drafting its constitution, forming governmental institutions, and defining its identity. Meanwhile, the United States quickly prepared to begin constructing the canal, a project that would require massive engineering efforts and thousands of workers from around the world. The canal would become one of the greatest infrastructure achievements in history, but the political origins of Panama's independence would remain controversial. The road to Panama's separation from Colombia was shaped by political frustration, international ambition, and strategic calculation. It was a moment when local aspirations aligned with global interests. For Panama, independence was the beginning of a long and complicated relationship with the United States, one marked by cooperation, tension, opportunity, and struggle. In 1903, a small province claimed its freedom and stepped onto the world stage. But the story of Panama's independence cannot be told without understanding the forces behind it. The dreams of a canal, the ambitions of powerful nations, and the determined efforts of a people who wanted their own future. After Panama declared independence in November 1903, with silent but decisive support from the United States, the new nation moved quickly to organize its government and establish international legitimacy. But even in these early days of freedom, one issue stood at the center of everything: the future of the Panama Canal. For decades, engineers and visionaries had dreamed of a waterway connecting the world's oceans. Now Panama's fate was intertwined with the realization of that dream. And at the heart of it was a single treaty, the Untold Treaty. This treaty, signed just days after Panama became a republic, would define the relationship between Panama and the United States for nearly a century. It gave the United States control over a vast strip of land across the isthmus, known as the Canal Zone, and granted the U.S. the right to build, administer, and defend the canal. For the United States, the treaty represented a triumph of diplomacy and strategy. For Panama, it became a source of both opportunity and resentment in agreement, born during a moment of weakness, yet impossible to avoid. To understand the treaty, one must look at the man behind it: Philippe Varilla, a French engineer and former executive of the failed French Canal Company. Although he had not lived in Panama for years, he acted as the new nation's representative, with strong connections to American officials. Varilla was determined to see the canal built, and he believed that only the United States had the resources to finish it. When Panama broke away from Colombia, he saw his opportunity. Within days of Panama's independence, Varilla met with U.S. Secretary of State John Hay in Washington. They drafted a treaty granting the United States sweeping authority over the Canal Zone, a strip of land 10 miles wide, stretching from ocean to ocean. The U.S. would have rights as if it were sovereign, meaning it could build towns, enforce its own laws, station troops, and control the territory without Panamanian involvement. In exchange, Panama would receive a payment and the promise of protection. But there was a problem. No Panamanian leader had been involved in writing the treaty. When the text arrived in Panama City, the newly formed government faced a difficult choice. The United States had ensured Panama's independence by preventing Colombia from sending troops. Rejecting the treaty could jeopardize that protection. Accepting it meant surrendering control over a major part of the nation's land and future. After intense debate, the Panamanian government approved the treaty reluctantly and under enormous pressure. Many leaders felt they had little choice. Panama was a tiny nation with no army and no international allies. The United States was powerful, wealthy, and determined to build the canal. If Panama wanted security and recognition, agreement seemed unavoidable. For the United States, the treaty marked a strategic victory. It secured exclusive access to build the canal, transforming America into a global maritime power. President Theodore Roosevelt celebrated the achievement, declaring that the canal would be the world's greatest commercial highway. Newspapers praised the deal as a historic milestone. The U.S. began preparations to start one of the largest engineering projects in history. In Panama, however, public reaction was mixed. Some saw the treaty as the price of independence, a necessary compromise that would bring jobs, development, and international importance. They believed the canal would transform Panama into a crossroads of the world, attracting ships, commerce, and opportunity. For these supporters, prosperity outweighed the loss of land. But others viewed the treaty as a betrayal of sovereignty. They argued that Panama had traded one form of foreign control for another. Critics pointed to the wording of the agreement, which allowed the United States almost unlimited authority over the Canal Zone, authority greater than Panama's own government possessed. They feared that this zone, cutting across the heart of the country, divided Panama physically and symbolically. The treaty ignited debates that would continue for decades. Life in the Canal Zone quickly began to take shape. The United States built administrative buildings, barracks, workshops, and neighborhoods for American workers. U.S. laws governed the territory. American flags flew over every official building. Schools, hospitals, and stores were run like small pieces of the United States, transplanted onto Panamanian soil. This new environment, known as the Zonian community, functioned as a separate world, modern, orderly, and distinctly American. For Panamanians living outside the zone, the contrast was striking. The Canal Zone had paved streets, clean water, modern sanitation, electricity, and well-planned housing benefits that many parts of Panama lacked. Workers from Panama and other countries were hired to help build the canal, but they were treated differently from their American counterparts. These divisions created resentment, highlighting the unequal nature of the arrangement. As construction progressed, the treaty's long-term impact became increasingly clear. The canal would eventually reshape global trade and transform Panama's geographical significance. But it also cemented the United States' role as the dominant power in the region. Generations of Panamanians would grow up viewing the Canal Zone as a reminder of a foreign power operating within their own territory. Still, despite controversy, the Habuna-Varilla Treaty laid the foundation for the canal that would change world history. Without it, Panama might not have achieved independence when it did, and the canal might never have been completed. The treaty represented both sacrifice and opportunity, both loss and future promise. Panama's road to separation from Colombia was only the beginning. The signing of the Habuna-Varilla Treaty marked the start of a new era, one defined by the construction of a global waterway and the complex relationship between Panama and the United States, a relationship that would shape the nation for nearly a century. When the United States secured control of the Canal Zone in 1903, the world watched with anticipation. The dream of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had captured imaginations for centuries. Explorers, engineers, merchants, and empires all understood the potential of a canal that could shorten global travel by thousands of miles. But few grasped how monumental the task truly was. Building the Panama Canal would become one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history and one of the most tragic. The French had already attempted the project in the late 1800s. Led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal, France believed it could repeat its earlier success. But Panama's geography and climate were nothing like Egypt's desert. The tropical rainforest, violent floods, shifting soil, and deadly diseases overwhelmed the French effort. After years of failure, bankruptcy, and the deaths of an estimated 20,000 workers, the French abandoned the project. What they left behind were rusting machines, half-dug trenches, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to reshape the earth. When the United States took over in 1904, it inherited not only the remains of the French attempt, but also the responsibility of solving the problems that had caused it to collapse. American engineers studied the French mistakes carefully. They realized that disease was the greatest enemy, not engineering. So before a single shovel of earth could be moved, the U.S. launched one of the most ambitious public health campaigns in history. Under the leadership of Dr. William Gorgas, a monumental effort began to eradicate yellow fever and malaria. Both diseases were spread by mosquitoes thriving in Panama's humid environment. Workers drained swamps, fumigated homes, installed window screens, and treated water sources. Barrels, puddles, and even footprints filled with rainwater were eliminated to destroy breeding grounds. Slowly, the death toll dropped. Yellow fever disappeared entirely from the Canal Zone, and malaria became manageable. This success was a turning point. It allowed the workforce to grow safely, and gave hope that the canal could finally be built. With health conditions improving, construction moved forward at a scale never seen before. Thousands of workers from around the world poured into Panama. Caribbean laborers, Americans, Europeans, and West Indians, each hoping for steady pay and opportunity. But their experiences were vastly different. American workers lived in comfortable housing, with clean water, electricity, and medical care. West Indian laborers, who made up the majority of the workforce, lived in crowded barracks, earned far lower wages, and faced harsher conditions. This unequal system, known as the gold roll and silver roll, created deep divisions that would later spark resentment among Panamanians and workers alike. The engineering challenges were immense. The Culebra Cut, a massive mountain ridge running across the isthmus, had to be carved away using explosives, steam shovels, and sheer manpower. Landslides constantly erased months of progress. Mountains seemed to collapse overnight. Workers labored in intense heat, mud, and dynamite blasts. It was dangerous, exhausting, and relentless. Yet progress continued, driven by determination and advanced machinery that the French never had. But the canal's most revolutionary feature was not the dig in it, was the lock system. Instead of creating a sea-level canal, the United States opted to build a series of giant concrete locks capable of lifting ships up to a man-made lake, Gatun Lake, and lowering them back down on the other side. This design solved the problem of unpredictable rainfall and mountainous terrain. The locks, each the size of a cathedral, were engineering marvels, massive chambers with steel gates, controlled by intricate hydraulic systems, capable of lifting enormous ships as if they were floating elevators. Construction sites across the Canal Zone buzzed with energy. Steam engines roared. Locomotives carried earth to miles-long dumps. Massive cranes and dredgers worked day and night. The air was filled with the sounds of industry hammering, drilling, blasting. The scale of the project was nearly unimaginable. More than 200 million cubic meters of earth were removed, enough to bury an entire city. Despite the progress, the human cost remained high. Thousands of workers died from accidents, disease, landslides, and harsh conditions. The exact number is unknown, but estimates range from 5,000 to over 30,000 across the French and American periods combined. The sacrifice of these laborers, many of them poor immigrants, was often overlooked in the celebratory narratives that followed. By 1913, the canal neared completion. For the first time in history, ships could pass from ocean to ocean without sailing around South America. In 1914, the Panama Canal officially opened, forever changing global trade, travel, and military strategy. It shortened routes, reduced costs, and gave the United States unprecedented control over maritime pathways. The world celebrated the engineering triumph, calling it a modern wonder. For Panama, however, the opening of the canal was bittersweet. The nation had gained global relevance, but it had also lost control of its most valuable territory. The Canal Zone remained under U.S. authority, functioning as a separate world inside Panama Place, where foreign law, foreign flags, and foreign communities operated independently from the Panamanian government. The completion of the canal symbolized brilliance, ambition, and technological mastery, but it also carried the weight of sacrifice of lives lost, families separated, and communities divided. It brought global recognition to the United States and placed Panama at the center of world trade. Yet the canal also deepened tensions about sovereignty, identity, and fairness, tensions that would grow over the decades to come. The building of the Panama Canal was a story of great achievement, intertwined with struggle and pain. It shaped the destiny of nations and marked a turning point in world history. But the price paid both in human lives and in national sovereignty would influence Panama's relationship with the United States for nearly a century. When the Panama Canal began operating in 1914, the Canal Zone became more than a workplace. It became a fully functioning society, a world within a world. Stretching 10 miles wide across the isthmus, the Canal Zone operated under American authority and quickly transformed into what many called a Little America. For almost a century, this territory existed as a strange blend of military base, suburban town, and colonial enclave. It was a place where American laws ruled, American culture thrived, and American communities lived separately from Panamanians, creating one of the most unique and controversial societies ever built outside U.S. borders. Walking into the Canal Zone felt like stepping into a different country. Neatly paved streets, lined with identical white houses, trimmed lawns, and American-style schools, stood in sharp contrast to the bustling, tropical streets of surrounding Panamanian cities. U.S. flags flew from government buildings. English was the dominant language, and zoning laws created orderly neighborhoods. To American families stationed there, the zone felt familiar, safe, and comfortable, a place where they could raise children with the conveniences of home, even while living in Central America. The zone was divided into residential areas, administrative centers, and military installations. The U.S. government owned every building, every road, every power line. The territory was organized with precision. Workers were divided into classes: American citizens, who held the top administrative and technical jobs, and the much larger workforce of West Indians, Panamanians, and immigrants, who handled manual labor and service positions. This dual structure mirrored the gold roll and silver roll system used during canal construction, creating deep social and economic divides. Inside the Canal Zone, the U.S. created a full ecosystem of American life. There were American-style grocery stores known as commissaries, stocked with U.S. brands rarely found elsewhere in Latin America. Gas stations operated under American companies. Postal services functioned as part of the U.S. postal system. Theaters played Hollywood films. Libraries carried American books and magazines. Schools followed US curricula, with students reciting the Pledge of Allegiance each morning. Even baseball fields were common America's national pastime, thriving in this tropical setting. The zone's residents enjoyed modern infrastructure, clean water, efficient sewage systems, well-maintained roads, electricity, and air conditioning. For many Americans, living in the Canal Zone felt like living in a middle-class suburb, transported into the jungle. Safety was a major appeal. U.S. military police patrolled the streets, crime rates were low, and strict regulations governed public behavior. Families enjoyed their own clubs, swimming pools, bowling alleys, and community events. Holidays like the 4th of July were celebrated with fireworks and parades, reinforcing the zone's identity as an extension of the United States. But outside the zone's borders, life in Panama was often very different. Many Panamanians viewed the zone with resentment. While the territory flourished with modern amenities, many surrounding communities struggled with limited resources, economic inequality, and uneven development. Panama City in Colon grew rapidly due to the canal's presence, but faced challenges like overcrowding, poverty, and infrastructure shortages. The contrast between the zone and the rest of Panama symbolized the broader imbalance between the two nations. Interactions between Americans in the zone and local Panamanians were limited by design. U.S. authorities enforced strict rules restricting Panamanian access to the zone, except for those who worked there. Many Panamanians felt excluded from land that geographically belonged to their country. For those who entered the zone to work, the experience was mixed. The zone offered steady wages and opportunities, but workers faced discrimination, limited mobility, and unequal pay. Social mixing was rare, and visitors often felt the invisible boundary separating them from American residents. Over time, a unique culture emerged among the children of American workers, known as Zonians. They grew up speaking English, attending U.S. schools, playing American sports, and living under U.S. laws. Yet they were surrounded by the tropical landscape and vibrant culture of Panama. Many Zonians developed a strong sense of identity that blended American patriotism with life abroad. They formed tight-knit communities that lasted generations, even after the zone's control eventually shifted. Military presence was another defining feature of life in the Canal Zone. The United States maintained bases to protect the canal, especially during global conflicts like World War II. Soldiers trained in the dense jungle, and the zone became a strategic hub for American operations. Military families lived alongside civilian residents, giving the community a disciplined, orderly atmosphere. The canal was considered vital to U.S. national security, and the zone functioned as both a home and a fortress. This insulated world created deep political tensions in Panama. Many Panamanians believed the zone represented a violation of national sovereignty, a constant reminder of the Habuna-Varilla Treaty that had been signed without Panamanian input. Over the decades, frustration grew. Students, intellectuals, and politicians increasingly viewed the zone as a foreign occupation on their soil. The more Americanized the zone became, the stronger the calls for Panamanian control grew. Yet, from the American perspective, the zone was essential for operating and protecting the canal. They saw it as a necessity, efficient, well-organized community, supporting one of the world's most important waterways. For them, the zone represented stability, security, and engineering excellence. For thousands of American families, it was home. The Canal Zone stood as a paradox, a thriving community built in the name of progress, but one that also symbolized foreign control and inequality. It brought prosperity to some, pride to others, and resentment to many. It embodied the complexities of international power, how nations build, negotiate, and compete over strategic spaces. For nearly a century, life in the Canal Zone continued in this strange dual-reality American territory in the heart of Panama. The pressure to resolve this contradiction would grow stronger as the 20th century progressed, eventually erupting into national protests and political negotiations that would redefine the relationship between Panama and the United States. The construction and operation of the Panama Canal transformed the small nation of Panama into one of the most strategically important countries in the world. Ships carrying goods, soldiers, and resources traveled between oceans in a matter of hours instead of weeks. This global waterway brought wealth, infrastructure, and international attention. Yet, beneath the success of the canal lay a more complicated reality. For Panama, the canal's economic impact was a story of growth mixed with dependency, opportunity mixed with inequality, and national pride mixed with frustration. After the United States secured control of the Canal Zone in 1903 and began construction shortly after, thousands of Panamanians found employment. The canal project created new jobs in transportation, construction, hospitality, and trade. Merchants in Panama City and Colon opened stores to serve workers and travelers. Housing markets expanded, and local businesses thrived from the influx of foreign laborers and American salaries. There was an undeniable boom in economic activity. For the first time in history, Panama became a center of global commerce. Yet the economic benefits were distributed unevenly. The Canal Zone operated like a separate country, with its own laws, wages, and social divisions. American workers received high salaries, medical care, modern housing, and imported goods. Meanwhile, Panamanian workers and West Indian laborers earned lower wages and lived under harsher conditions. This created a dual economy, one wealthy and Americanized, the other underpaid and marginalized. The contrast between the two systems deepened resentment among Panamanians, who felt excluded from the prosperity happening in their own country. The presence of the Canal Zone also shaped the development of Panama's cities. Panama City and Colon became bustling hubs of commerce, attracting migrants from rural areas and neighboring countries. Hotels, banks, and trading companies flourished. But rapid growth created problems. Overcrowding strained housing and sanitation systems. Many neighborhoods developed without proper planning, leading to poverty and inequality just outside the modern, well-maintained zone. The wealth of the zone highlighted the lack of investment in many Panamanian communities, reinforcing the feeling that the benefits of the canal were not reaching ordinary citizens. Economically, Panama became heavily dependent on the canal. Government revenues often came from American payments, port fees, and trade activities linked to the waterway. While this created financial stability, it also meant the nation's economic health depended on decisions made in Washington, not Panama City. When global markets shifted or U.S. policies changed, Panama felt the effects immediately. This dependency made it difficult for Panama to diversify its economy or invest in local industries. At the same time, American control of the Canal Zone limited Panama's ability to profit from its own most valuable asset. The United States earned tolls from ships and controlled administrative jobs. Panama received annual payments, but these sums were modest compared to the canal's overall revenue. Many Panamanians viewed this arrangement as unfair, a treaty signed under pressure, now costing the nation millions in potential income. Politicians and activists argued that Panama deserved a larger share of the canal's economic value. The canal also influenced Panama's social fabric. The steady presence of American culture reshaped daily life. English became widely spoken in business settings. American products, entertainment, and institutions influenced Panamanian society. While some embraced these cultural connections, others felt that Panama's identity was slowly being overshadowed. This cultural imbalance added another layer to the economic divide, the feeling that wealth and opportunity were tied to foreign influence rather than national development. Panama's economy, driven by the canal, created opportunities but also reinforced inequality. The gold roll and silver roll systems created racial and economic hierarchies that lasted long after the canal was completed. These divisions affected wages, housing, and job opportunities for generations. West Indian communities, whose ancestors had built the canal through grueling labor, often remained marginalized despite their essential contributions. As decades passed, political leaders in Panama increasingly questioned the fairness of the economic relationship with the United States. They argued that Panama was carrying the weight of global commerce while receiving too little in return. Students, intellectuals, and workers organized movements demanding a new economic agreement. They believed that Panama's prosperity could only truly flourish when the nation gained greater control over the canal and the zone's economy. By the mid-20th century, these tensions intensified. The canal brought wealth, but the distribution of that wealth created deep social divides. Some Panamanians thrived in the commercial boom, while others struggled with inequality. Dependence on the canal made the country vulnerable to outside decisions. Every political and economic debate eventually returned to one central truth. Panama needed more control over its own destiny. The economic story of the canal is not simply one of success or failure. It is a story of transformation, how a global waterway shaped a nation's development, identity, and aspirations. It lifted Panama onto the world stage, but also bound its economy tightly to foreign power. This mixture of growth, inequality, and dependency fueled the nationalist movements that would later challenge the United States' long-standing control and demand a new era of sovereignty. The canal gave Panama opportunity, but it also gave the nation a mission: to reclaim what was built on its land and define its own economic future. By the mid-20th century, Panama had spent decades living in the shadow of the Canal Zone territory, inside its borders controlled by a foreign power. While the canal brought global importance and jobs, it also created a profound sense of injustice. Millions of dollars flowed through the canal each year, yet Panama received only a fraction of its value. American flags flew over land that many Panamanians believed rightfully belonged to them. These frustrations gradually gave rise to a powerful wave of nationalism, one that would redefine Panama's identity and reshape its future. The early sparks of nationalism began shortly after the canal opened, but they grew stronger with each generation. Students, teachers, workers, and intellectuals increasingly questioned the fairness of the Habuna-Varela Treaty. This treaty, signed without Panamanian participation, had given the U.S. near sovereign control of the Canal Zone. For many, the treaty symbolized loss of territory, dignity, and control over the nation's destiny. Panamanians grew up seeing the Canal Zone as a world apart. On one side of a simple fence, American communities enjoyed modern housing, clean streets, parks, and well-funded schools. On the other side, many Panamanians lived with limited infrastructure, uneven development, and fewer opportunities. The contrast was not just economic, it was emotional. It reminded the population daily that Panama was divided, not just by geography but by power. Students played a major role in shaping the nationalist movement. The University of Panama became a center for debate, speeches, and political organizing. Young Panamanians, inspired by global independence movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, demanded a re-evaluation of Panama's relationship with the United States. Student leaders argued that a nation could not call itself truly independent as long as a foreign power controlled its most valuable territory. Street demonstrations became more frequent. Protesters marched to the edges of the Canal Zone, waving Panamanian flags and demanding justice. Many emphasized the symbolism of the flag itself. The right to raise Panama's national flag inside the zone became a major point of conflict. Panamanians wanted acknowledgement that the zone was part of their country. Even if controlled by the U.S., the refusal of American authorities to allow such displays only intensified tensions. At the heart of rising nationalism was the belief that Panama deserved territorial, complete, and respected sovereignty. This meant more than symbolic gestures. It included economic independence, fair compensation for the canal, and full control over the territory carved through the center of the nation. The canal was not just an engineering marvel. To Panamanians, it was part of their homeland, built through sweat, struggle, and sacrifice. Political leaders gradually embraced nationalist demands. Presidents, legislators, and diplomats pushed for renegotiation of the treaty. They argued that the arrangements made in 1903 no longer reflected modern realities. The world had changed, Panama had changed, and the canal had become far more valuable than anyone in 1903 had imagined. They sought partnerships, not submission, cooperation, not domination. The United States, however, viewed the canal through the lens of global strategy. To American policymakers, the canal was essential for military mobility, national security, and international trade. Control of the Canal Zone meant control of a major artery of global commerce. From Washington's perspective, relinquishing authority could weaken U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. This belief led to decades of diplomatic standoffs, negotiations, and occasional conflicts. Meanwhile, everyday tensions continued to build. Panamanian workers in the Canal Zone faced wage disparities and discrimination. While American employees enjoyed strong salaries and privileges, local workers often remained in lower positions with fewer benefits. This created anger not just about national sovereignty, but also about economic justice. Panamanians felt that their labor was essential to the canal's operation, yet they were not treated equally. Cultural differences further fueled nationalism. American schools and clubs inside the zone reinforced U.S. identity, while Panamanians developed a stronger sense of their own distinct culture. Music, literature, and art, celebrated Panamanian pride, featuring themes of resistance and unity. Poets wrote verses about reclaiming the isthmus. Musicians composed songs honoring national heroes, and newspapers published editorials pushing for reform. The international context also played a role. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, countries around the world were fighting to end colonial rule. Panama saw itself reflected in these movements. Leaders and activists argued that the Canal Zone was a relic of a colonial past, incompatible with modern ideals of sovereignty. This global wave of decolonization gave strength to Panama's calls for change. By the early 1960s, nationalism had grown too powerful to ignore. Protests increased, diplomatic pressure mounted, and the demand for a new treaty became a national consensus. The U.S. government began recognizing that Panama's frustration could lead to instability, and instability in the canal was unacceptable to global trade. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the relationship between Panama and the United States. The rise of nationalism was no longer just a political movement. It was a national awakening. Panamanians were determined to regain control of their territory, their canal, and their identity. This growing tide of nationalism would soon erupt into a dramatic and violent turning point and event that would force both nations to confront the unresolved tensions created decades earlier. The struggle for sovereignty was entering its most intense chapter. By the early 1960s, tensions between Panama and the United States were no longer simmering quietly, they were boiling. The Canal Zone remained a world apart, a strip of land where American laws and culture dominated, and where Panamanian sovereignty was visible only in its absence. For decades, Panamanians had protested for equal rights, fair treaties, and recognition of national dignity. But these protests had often ended in frustration. Everything changed, however, in January 1964. What began as a dispute over flags exploded into one of the most defining crises in the history of U.S.-Panama relations. The conflict centered on a powerful symbol, the national flag of Panama. Two Panamanians raising their flag inside the Canal Zone was a demand for respect and acknowledgement. They believed that a single national flag could demonstrate unity and sovereignty across the isthmus. But to many Americans living in the zone, the U.S. flag stood as a reminder of their authority and identity. The simple act of raising two flags side by side, one Panamanian and one American, became a battleground of pride, anger, and unresolved history. In 1963, after growing pressure from Panama, the United States agreed to fly both flags together in certain public areas of the zone. The symbolic gesture aimed to ease tensions, but it was met with resistance from many American residents. Some felt the agreement diminished U.S. authority. Others openly opposed the idea of recognizing Panamanian claims inside the zone. Meanwhile, Panamanians viewed the dual flag policy as the first step toward reclaiming lost sovereignty. The stage was set for confrontation. On January 9, 1964, Panamanian students marched to Balboa High School in the Canal Zone to raise the Panamanian flag, according to the agreement. They carried their flag with solemn respect, believing they were exercising a right their nation had long been denied. But when they arrived, they encountered American students who confronted them angrily. A heated exchange followed. Voices rose. Insults were shouted. In the chaos, the Panamanian flag was torn. For Panamanians, the tearing of their flag was not just an accident, it was an insult to national dignity. News spread instantly across the city. Crowds gathered, students protested aggressively, and anger surged like a wave. The tearing of the flag symbolized decades of humiliation, inequality, and foreign domination. By evening, demonstrations had erupted across Panama City, and tensions escalated into violence. Panamanian protesters clashed with Canal Zone police and U.S. military forces. Rocks were thrown, buildings burned, and shots were fired. Chaos gripped the streets as thousands joined the protests. The violence spread quickly, fueled by long-standing resentment and emotional fury. The Panamanian government, overwhelmed, struggled to calm the situation. That night, the U.S. military reinforced positions in the zone, further inflaming the anger of the Panamanian people. The clashes continued for days. By the time the riots ended, at least 20 Panamanians and several Americans had been killed. Hundreds were injured. The violence left deep wounds, physical, emotional, and political. For Panama, January 9th became a national day of mourning and remembrance. The event marked a turning point. The people had shown they would no longer tolerate disrespect, inequality, or the continued presence of a foreign-controlled territory on their soil. The riots shocked the world. International media broadcast images of burning buildings, crowds of protesters, and armed forces defending the Canal Zone. Many nations questioned why such a vital waterway remained under foreign control half a century after Panama's independence. The unrest revealed the depth of resentment that had quietly grown over generations. It exposed the fragile nature of U.S. legitimacy in the zone and the unsustainable imbalance between the two countries. The Panamanian government responded decisively. President Roberto Chiari took a historic step. He severed diplomatic relations with the United States. This bold move sent a clear message that Panama would no longer negotiate under unequal conditions. The U.S. government, shocked by the scale of the crisis, realized that ignoring Panama's demands was no longer an option. The riots had turned Panama's requests from political pressure into an international crisis. In Washington, discussions began about revising the outdated agreements that governed the canal. Officials acknowledged that the situation could not remain unchanged. The U.S. recognized that stability in the region depended on addressing Panamanian grievances. The conflict over flags had exposed something far deeper, a century of frustration rooted in sovereignty, identity, and fairness. For Panamanians, the events of January 1964 strengthened national unity. The torn flag became a symbol of resistance and dignity. Students who had marched peacefully became national heroes. Families of those killed in the riots became symbols of sacrifice. The movement for sovereignty intensified, and the demand for a new treaty gained unstoppable momentum. In the years that followed, negotiations between the United States and Panama progressed slowly but steadily. The riots had forced both nations to confront the realities of colonial-era agreements in a modern world. Panama's determination, fueled by the events of 1964, laid the foundation for the changes that would ultimately return the canal to Panamanian control. The 1964 Flag Riots were not just a protest, they were a turning point. A moment when a nation demanded recognition and dignity. They marked the beginning of the end for the Canal Zone as an American-governed enclave. And they set Panama on the path toward reclaiming its sovereignty and shaping its future. As the steward of one of the world's most important waterways, the events of 1964 changed everything. After the Flag Riots, Panama had made its message unmistakably clear. The canal could not remain under American control forever. The violence and anger of that week revealed that the status quo was unsustainable. The United States understood that ignoring Panama's demands could threaten the stability of one of the world's most important waterways. Panama, united as never before, refused to accept anything less than sovereignty. It was only a matter of time before both nations would be forced to sit down and renegotiate the future of the canal. And that moment came in the 1970s. By the mid-1970s, Panama was led by General Omar Torrijos, a charismatic and determined figure who became the voice of Panamanian nationalism. Torrijos was not an elected leader in the traditional sense, but he enjoyed broad support because he promised what generations had demanded: dignity, sovereignty, and control over the canal. He traveled across the country, speaking to workers, farmers, students, and families, reminding them that the canal was part of their national heritage. Under his leadership, Panama intensified its diplomatic campaign to regain control of its territory. Torrijos understood that this fight would not be won by violence, it had to be won by diplomacy. He began building alliances across Latin America and the global South. He appealed to the United Nations, arguing that Panama was the last country in the hemisphere still living under a colonial-era agreement. The world listened. Pressure mounted on the United States to reconsider its long-held position. In Washington, President Jimmy Carter took office in 1977 with a commitment to fairness, human rights, and international cooperation. Carter believed that the U.S. could not promote global justice while holding onto a territory that rightfully belonged to another nation. He understood the importance of the canal, but also recognized the legitimacy of Panama's claims. Carter and Torrijos, though different in background and ideology, found common ground in their desire for peaceful resolution. Negotiations between the two nations were long and complex. American leaders worried about losing strategic control, while Panamanian officials insisted that no agreement would be acceptable unless it guaranteed full sovereignty. Diplomats debated every detail from security arrangements to economic rights, from transition timelines to the display of national flags. The talks lasted months, sometimes stalling, sometimes making progress. But neither side walked away. Finally, on September 7, 1977, history was made. In a ceremony watched by millions around the world, President Jimmy Carter and General Omar Torrijos signed two treaties that would change the future of both nations: the Panama Canal Treaty and the Neutrality Treaty. The Panama Canal Treaty established a clear and gradual transition. Over the next 22 years, the United States would slowly transfer control, authority, and responsibility to Panama. Step by step, management positions, security duties, and administrative functions would shift from American hands to Panamanian hands. The Canal Zone itself would be abolished, ending the system that had separated Americans and Panamanians for generations. By December 31, 1999, Panama would fully own and operate the canal. The Neutrality Treaty ensured that, even after the transfer, the canal would remain open and neutral for ships from all nations. The United States retained the right to help defend the canal, if necessary, but not to occupy or govern it. This treaty protected global trade, while honoring Panama's sovereignty. For Panama, the signing was a moment of national triumph. Crowds gathered in plazas, waving flags, crying with pride, and celebrating what many saw as the fulfillment of a century-long dream. Torrijos returned home a hero. He had accomplished something that generations believed impossible. He had negotiated the return of the canal through diplomacy, determination, and unity. For the United States, the treaties represented a shift toward a more just and cooperative foreign policy. Although controversial in Americas, some politicians protested that the U.S. was giving away strategic asset. Carter stood firm, believing that respecting Panama's sovereignty was the right thing to do. Over time, even many critics came to accept the treaties as a landmark achievement of diplomacy. The Torrijos treaties transformed the Panama Canal from a symbol of foreign domination into a symbol of national pride. They opened the door to new opportunities for Panama economic growth, international recognition, and the chance to run one of the most important waterways on Earth. But they also marked something deeper: the moment when Panama reclaimed its dignity and took control of its own destiny. These treaties did not erase the past, but they redefined the future. They ended decades of resentment, ended the isolation of the Canal Zone, and set Panama on the path toward becoming the sovereign guardian of a global treasure. For the first time in its history, the nation could look at the canal not as a reminder of division, but as a symbol of unity, strength, and possibility. The world had witnessed a rare victory of diplomacy over conflict. And for Panama, the signing of the Torrijos treaties became one of the most important chapters in its journey toward full independence, a journey that would culminate at the end of the century, when the last U.S. flag in the Canal Zone would be lowered forever. After the signing of the Torrijos treaties in 1977, Panama and the United States entered a new era, one defined not by conflict but by cooperation, patience, and careful transition. The treaties marked a turning point: the end of the Canal Zone as a U.S.-governed enclave and the beginning of a shared step-by-step transfer of authority to Panama. This transition, spanning from 1979 to 1999, was one of the most complex diplomatic and administrative undertakings of the century. It required trust, discipline, and a shared commitment to stability in one of the world's most important waterways. The first major milestone came on October 1, 1979, when the Canal Zone officially ceased to exist. For the first time in more than 70 years, the fences that separated Panamanians from the zone were removed, and the land became open to the public. Streets that had once been restricted to U.S. personnel now belonged to Panama. Government buildings, neighborhoods, and military installations began shifting to Panamanian jurisdiction. The transformation was both symbolic and deeply emotional. Many Panamanians walked into areas they had seen from a distance their entire lives, places that had once felt off limits, now part of their nation again. Yet the canal itself did not change hands overnight. The Torrijos treaties called for a gradual transfer, ensuring that Panama would be fully prepared to operate the canal independently by 1999. This required an enormous effort in training, management, engineering, and leadership. Panamanian workers had long been part of the canal's operations, but now they would take on responsibilities previously reserved for American administrators, engineers, and pilots. New training programs were established to prepare Panamanians for high-level positions in navigation, maintenance, hydrology, and administration. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Panamanians steadily rose through the ranks. Little by little, they replaced the U.S. experts who had run the canal for generations. The process was deliberate and collaborative. American specialists taught Panamanian workers everything from controlling the locks to managing water levels in Gatun Lake. It became a real-life demonstration of the treaties in action, two nations working side by side to ensure the canal's future. Meanwhile, U.S. military bases also began closing or transitioning to Panamanian control. Facilities that had once projected American power across the hemisphere slowly reoriented toward Panama's needs. Some bases became universities, parks, government buildings, or residential communities. This transformation reshaped the landscape of the isthmus, turning former military strongholds into centers of civilian life. The transition was not without challenges. Panama faced periods of political instability, including the rise and fall of General Manuel Noriega, whose dictatorship and eventual removal by U.S. military action in 1989 threatened to derail the treaties. Yet, even during these turbulent years, the canal remained stable, protected by the structure and agreements put in place by the treaties. Both nations recognized that the canal was too important to global trade to become a casualty of politics. Throughout the 1990s, the pace of transfer accelerated. Panamanian engineers, administrators, and specialists took over nearly all operational responsibilities. The United States shifted into an advisory role, preparing for the final handover. By 1995, most of the canal's management was already in Panamanian hands, and international observers commended the professionalism with which the transition was being handled. For ordinary Panamanians, the transition brought a renewed sense of pride. The canal had long been seen as a symbol of foreign control, but now it represented a future shaped by Panamanian talent, leadership, and ambition. Schools taught children about the approaching handover, and national celebrations highlighted each major milestone. The dream that had inspired generations was becoming reality. As the final years approached, attention turned to December 31, 1999, the day Panama would assume full control. Preparations intensified. Security plans were finalized, administrative structures strengthened, and international partners reassured that the canal would remain neutral and efficient. The world watched closely. For many countries dependent on global trade, the stability of the canal was essential. On the night of December 31, 1999, history came full circle. In a ceremony attended by leaders, diplomats, workers, and citizens, the last U.S. flag was lowered in the Canal Zone. The Panamanian flag rose in its place, flying proudly over a territory that had finally returned to the nation. Fireworks lit the sky. Crowds celebrated in the streets. The moment was emotional, triumphant, and symbolic beyond words. After nearly a century of foreign control, Panama was now the full and rightful guardian of the canal. The 20-year transition had succeeded. It proved that complex international agreements could work when built on trust and mutual respect. It showed that a small nation could prepare to manage one of the world's most important waterways with professionalism and vision. And it reshaped the relationship between Panama and the United States, no longer defined by occupation, but by cooperation. The handover of the canal was not just a transfer of territory. It was the culmination of a long journey towards sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. It marked the closing of one chapter in Panama's history, and the beginning of another one, in which the canal would finally serve the nation that had always called it home. As the final hours of the 20th century approached, the people of Panama prepared for a moment they had waited for since the birth of their nation. December 31, 1999, was not just the end of a year or a century, it was the end of an era that had shaped Panama's identity, economy, and destiny. After nearly 100 years of American control, the Panama Canal, one of the most strategically important waterways in the world, was about to return fully to Panamanian hands. The day would mark the closing of a long chapter and the opening of a future defined by sovereignty and possibility. Throughout the final week of December, anticipation filled the air. Flags hung from balconies. Newspapers published stories honoring the generations who had fought for sovereignty. Television stations broadcast documentaries about the canal's history. Schools taught special lessons on national pride. Everywhere, the message was clear. Panama was ready. The ceremony itself took place at the administration building in Balboa, overlooking the canal that had carried millions of ships across its locks since 1914. Government officials, international diplomats, canal workers, and citizens gathered under the warm tropical sun. Music filled the air. Veterans of the nationalist movement stood alongside young Panamanians who had grown up watching their country transform during the 20-year transition. For many, the moment felt surreal, something their grandparents had dreamed of, something their parents had protested for, and something they would finally witness with their own eyes. As the ceremony began, the atmosphere grew solemn. Representatives from the United States spoke about the decades of cooperation and the importance of the canal to global trade. Panamanian leaders expressed gratitude for the peaceful transition and emphasized the nation's readiness to take on the responsibility. But the symbolic heart of the ceremony came when the U.S. flag was lowered for the last time in the Canal Zone. Slowly and carefully, it descended, a gesture heavy with history, sacrifice, and emotion. Then, the Panamanian flag rose in its place, waving proudly in the wind. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers, and tears. For many, it was more than a ceremony, it was the restoration of dignity. Panama had reclaimed its land, its identity, and its place in the world. The canal, long associated with foreign power, was now a symbol of national pride. But the handover was not only symbolic. It marked a profound shift in Panama's political and economic future. Under Panamanian control, the canal would be operated by the Panama Canal Authority (ACP), a professional and autonomous organization created to ensure efficiency, neutrality, and modernization. Panama inherited a massive logistical challenge, maintaining the canal, expanding its capacity, and managing its role in a rapidly changing global economy. Yet the nation entered this new chapter with confidence. Panama understood that the canal was more than a waterway, it was a bridge to the world. Its success depended on professionalism, innovation, and a commitment to global neutrality. The transition also provided Panama with new revenue streams. Instead of receiving a modest annual payment from the U.S., the canal's tolls, profits, and international partnerships would now directly benefit the Panamanian people. These funds helped build schools, roads, hospitals, and infrastructure that transformed the nation in the decades that followed. The world watched closely after the handover, curious whether Panama could manage the canal as efficiently as the United States. Those doubts were quickly dispelled. Under Panamanian leadership, the canal not only continued to operate smoothly but also grew in capability and prestige. In 2016, Panama completed a massive expansion, adding new locks wide enough for modern supertankers and megaships. This project, one of the largest engineering feats since the canal's original construction, demonstrated Panama's commitment to ensuring that the canal remained vital in the 21st century. For Panamanians, the handover brought more than economic opportunity, brought emotional closure. For generations, the Canal Zone had been a symbol of division, inequality, and foreign presence. Now, the canal represented unity and self-determination. Streets that once separated Americans and Panamanians became shared spaces. Former military bases transformed into parks, universities, and residential communities. What had once been restricted territory became part of the nation's landscape again. The end of American control also reshaped Panama's international identity. No longer defined by a treaty written without its involvement, Panama stepped into the world as a fully sovereign nation. Diplomatically, it strengthened its relationships across Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond. The canal became a source of pride and influence, positioning Panama as a key player in global trade. The transfer of the canal in 1999 remains one of the most remarkable examples of peaceful negotiation and cooperation in modern history. It demonstrated that two nations with different interests could work together over decades to achieve a solution rooted in fairness, respect, and shared vision. It proved that sovereignty can be restored, not only through conflict, but through diplomacy and persistence. As the fireworks of the year 2000 burst across the sky, the people of Panama celebrated not just a new millennium, but a new beginning. The canal that had been built with foreign ambition was now in the hands of the nation, whose land had carried its weight. The century-long journey, from separation with Colombia, through foreign control, riots, negotiations, and agreements had reached its end. Panama had taken back the canal, and with it, the nation stepped confidently into a new era, one where its future would be shaped not by foreign powers, but by the will, talent, and pride of the Panamanian people.